Marom is an historian and historical geographer who specializes in the history of rural Palestine during the late Ottoman and British Mandate periods. Am I right?
Yes.
Okay. He completed his BA and MA both summa cum laude at the Department of Middle East Studies History in Tel Aviv University. He won the Rotenstreich and Azrieli graduate fellowships during his doctorate studies at the University of Haifa. He's currently designing he got the Fulbright postdoctoral fellow at the University of California very soon.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
I told you to be concise and take only some points of this presentation. Let's try and find our lost.
It should be on
somewhere here. Yes. Okay.
Okay.
As,
just let's if you want Professor Yum to see it, you have to
open Professor Yum. How? No. Please do help.
Just point share. If you have problem going through it, well.
We have experts here.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. So, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. I have been extensively presented here, but I would like to talk today a little bit about land regimes, land tenure, and settlement in Ottoman and British Mandate Palestine. I would like to begin with a short disclaimer that it is a matter of perspective. An empty land, a settled land, unsettled land, and I'm not going to give you a full picture of my studies, but I would like to raise a few questions and to try and ask how it is best to frame this subject. I will try to put Yum a little bit on the side so I can see it better. Okay, now I can see. So why? So let's begin by examining the big picture. My PhD and my studies revolved originally on the Sharon plain and the western part of Samaria. It is the central part of Palestine's coastal plain. Here in Acre we are on the southern tip of, or the part of the northern coastal plain, while as you know, from Haifa to the south to El Arish, we sit in a different littoral plain. So why does it matter? Why? What is the big picture, and how can my research enlighten or shed new light on broader demographic transformations in the Levant? I put here a few dichotomies. And first of all, we have the interactions between the littoral and the hinterland. A lot of researchers concern the importance of the littorals and coastal plains in modernization and development and trade. We have the interactions between plains and highlands. The lowlands can also extend into the Jezreel Valley, into the Jordan Valley. They have their own special characters, while the central highlands of Israel-Palestine have their own special characteristics that continue into Lebanon and then to Syria. We have the notion of a core of settlement and settlement peripheries. That is, there is a stable area and there is some area that is marginalized. We have settled land and unsettled land. We have cities and towns and villages. That is not only a matter of magnitude, that is a village is smaller by definition from a city, but it's also an administrative question. It's also a social and economic construct, because we had the question whether acre will be considered.
You have to mute it if you want.
How can I do that?
Just click on yes.
Oh, okay. So it is bad to mute an internationally renowned professor, but it will be for a short time at least. So again, during the Middle Ages, after the Mamluk occupation of Acre and Caesarea were still considered as towns or as cities, as nafs, in Ottoman Turkish, but of course they were abandoned. We had the town of Lajun in the 1600 was one of Palestine's provincial capitals, Megiddo, that is to say. While another village close by with about 10 times its population was considered a village, and so and so. And towns have their own special dialects and stuff like that. We have the questions of the origin of the growth, whether it is internal growth or is part of transnational migrations. We have the interactions between empires and the populations or the subjects. And we have the question of global economic integration, the rise of national and regional identities, and all of the age of the isms that are written here, and I will not repeat them. And the notion of locality, that is the interactions between some broad, transformative, global phenomena and the different levels of settlement on the regional, village, and clan level. So what? This is the Levant with its modern borders, but one is very difficult to get one without this on a modern. And my project concerns a certain section in the middle of the country. You can see here the main points is that there was, since the 17th century, a process of gradual demographic growth and westward expansion of the Pale of Settlement from the mountains into the coastal plain. You can see, just for reference, this is a map that shows the settlement, let's say, patterns in the end of the 16th century, around 1600. And then you can see how on a gradual process the settlement started to expand, the Pale of Settlement started to expand westwardly until it arrived at the end of the British Mandate to cover all of this area. And of course, this is not a complete map because you don't see here the Jewish settlements, which were nearly as many in this section of the country. But again, this was not my subject of research. And how? So we have the question of historiography, traditional Israeli scholarship, and this holds for the rest of the country as well. Most researchers, geographers relied on Western travelers' literature and other foreign sources as a staple of their craft. The reason for that is linguistical improficiencies, because they perhaps are very fluent in French and German and English, but they find Arabic and more so even Ottoman Turkish to be excruciatingly difficult, and it is indeed excruciatingly difficult. And they present the Sharon prior to Zionist colonization as a barren land dotted here and there by a few hamlets and Bedouin tribes, and they regard the Zionist project or other colonial endeavors as the primary principal source of progress, technological development, and socio-economical modernization. Over the last decades, a lot of native corpora of evidence became known, and they present a much more complex and rich picture of the local settlements. And people try to explain this on two different ways, in two different ways. The first one is Palestinian researchers try to highlight the internal growth of the population here as if this was a geographically distinct and defined land, that is Palestine, that is Metula, is in Palestine, but Ayun is something, Marj Ayun in Lebanon is something different. Or is in Gev, as somebody called it a few in the discussions ago, is somewhat different from the village of Fik on the Golan Heights. While Israeli geographers tried to highlight this country as destination for external migrations of Circassians, of Bosniaks, of Algerians, of Egyptians, and many, many other groups. I showed in my work that the expansion of settlement was a complex and multifaceted process that took place under the influence of local and regional factors, and that the spatial and temporal dimensions of this process are best viewed through the prism of evolving systems of land ownership, possession, and tenure. And I would like to highlight this issue because perhaps this will be my main contribution to the people who hear us now, because this is the main point that is relevant to other areas in the country. First of all, we have I mentioned dichotomies of settled land and unsettled landscape. So if you look above, you see, this train of camels going by, and the land is barren, and you can barely see any vegetation. And underneath you can see 2 or 3 different Jewish moshavot or settlements, and as if this is a pretension of modernity, and on the upper side it's not. So first of all, the upper side, this let's say this desolation was the result of extensive and extremely extensive land use that resulted in environmental disaster, because there were so many flocks. The agriculture was so abusing the land that it became nearly deforested. And all of these camels carry oranges, which is an export crop, which is one of the telltale signs of modernity. They are being transported to the ports of Jaffa and Haifa to be carried overseas in containers. And underneath, indeed, on the left we have a Jewish colony, but you can see how extensive its lands, and again there you can also see that the land is barely cultivated, and on the right you can see an Arabic orchard next to a Jewish settlement, but it's not a Jewish orchard. Again, prevailing paradigms, as I said, people try to show long-term internal growth versus external migration. The main point is that people relied on point particle analysis, that is, trying to show where different villages were and ignore all of their internal complexities and ties to broader patterns of settlement. This is on the part of geographers, while on the sides of the, let's say, economists or demographers, there was an abuse of British statistical data, because we have nearly no statistical data that is in any way relevant on the level of the separate village. We have 2 badly executed censi, and we have then after that we have a lot of let's say extrapolations that even the British statisticians of the time said that they are totally irrelevant on the level of the village. Okay, so this is examples. What are our sources for the study of Ottoman Palestine, or even in certain degree also British mandate Palestine? We have registers of the Sharia courts, of protocols of people coming to court and trying to address justice. We have the TAPO registers that our fellow has talked before about. We have local family archives and village mukhtar, the village headman files. We have a lot of administrative petitions to the Sultan and official decrees. We have decisions by municipal councils and religious ordinances, diplomatic correspondence, and secondary sources. I'm not really sure whether we should classify the secondary or primary, the evidence of oral histories, local knowledge, ethnographic research, and all of these, or nearly all of these sources have been nearly ignored because they are not easily accessible and they require specialty. Let's talk a little bit about systems of tenurials. Tenurial is a very important notion. Tenurial refers to system of land ownership, possession, and use. One should distinguish between these different levels. First of all, ownership is the formal question, who owns the land, while possession regards the land is held by whom, and use can be many, many different things. You can have a right of passage, you can have a right to cut wood, you can have a right to graze, and those different rights are not mutually exclusive, but they are not also fully, let's say, not integrated, let's say something. They do not overlap. So systems of land use, ownership, and possession reflect the changing realities of settlement and desertion. They are connected with specific populations, in my case, islanders, tribes, from different groups, and they have placed limitations on later waves of settlement. How, for example, if somebody uses this forest for felling trees, the land will not be benefit, for example, they will be perhaps available for agriculture, but will not be suitable for this type of exploitation. And they've led to changes in the physical environment and thus facilitated or restricted future patterns of future human activity, agriculture, grazing, deforestation, and were dynamic in nature, changing by land sales, practice, or the use of force. I suggest that typonymy and legal documents and cadastral maps offer evidence for even earlier stages in the process. I will try to show one example or two. In my case, I've shown that possession of land was a prerequisite for seasonal and later permanent habitation. I've showed how the establishment of new settlement villages, that is daughter villages on land belonging to hill villages in the eastern part of the Sharon, during the middle of the 18th century facilitated the growth of settlements even in the western parts of the Sharon, when these these villages became independent. And the home villages and settlements remained linked by bonds of kinship, marriage, trade, and land ownership for centuries to come. And here we have, for example, the great oak forest of Sharon, one of the main characters of this area. There was this open park woodland covering about 15,000 hectares, which is a lot. And we can see how mountain villages own this land in common. It was partitioned early into village common lands, utilizes on a seasonal basis for grazing and felling, and during the 19th century we have the establishment of khirbas, and then they become fixated, and the reason for that, the main, as it turned out to be, the main reason for that was the demand for cash crops, originally cotton, later watermelons, and in the end we had orchards. And there is partial overlap with the type of registration and the territorial claims of nomads. So here is, for example, a very complex system of allocation of forest land between different villages in the mountains. You can see there are about 16 different territories altogether, and this challenges the notions, first of all, of an empty land. The second is a land without use, because even if people do not reside here on a fixed basis, or each and every parcel of land had a certain allocated use, had its owners, had a name, and again, it allows us even to extrapolate the general, let's say, coverage of the forest in the early 19th century. One example of this might be the lands of Beit Lid. Beit Lid is a very famous junction known to any and all Israelis. Today it is known as Tzomet HaSharon. I've shown that the Masha lands were held in common by the male inhabitants of this village. In 1871, as part of the Tanzimat reforms, the Ottoman registered the lands in the name of 20 prominent members of the two families who settled in this khirba. And then there was the effective division of the common land according to a place of residency, that is the mountain village, 30 kilometers away, and the khirba, but without relinquishing legal rights. About 1900, there was an acquisition of land by certain land proprietors from another village, and they brought new tenants to reside there. But there were outstanding legal disputes about the status of the land and rights of land ownership, possession, and use throughout the British Mandate period that came to an end only by the depopulation of this space. Again, there were many tribal groups in the Sharon. One might ask, why does it matter? And the reason it matters is this map, which shows the different ways of migration into this country. But again, this tells only half the truth. This is, in fact, I must not apologize, but I must give a Gilui Naot, because I made this presentation late night yesterday, and I reused some older materials, but we now know that it was an open space. Yes, there were a lot of migrations from Egypt into Palestine. We all know of Ibrahim Pasha's occupation of Palestine for 10 years between 1831 and 1840 as part of his father's Mehmet Ali's expansion, trying to take over the Levant and Syria and Anatolia and such. But again, this is immensely highlighted in writing about the history of the countryside, Palestinian countryside, in Eretz Israel, Palestine. But we had, if not equivalent, even greater migration and forced population transfers of Falachin, of peasantry from Nablus, from Jerusalem, from Safad into Egypt. And if we were to go to the Delta in Egypt today, we will find a lot of Nabulsis, Safadis, Khalilis, and Makdisis living there. Okay, so we need to take this into account when assessing this subject. Again, another case study, the last one I would like to mention briefly is the landed estates, another hallmark of capitalism, modernization. But again, does it really change so much? Let's have a look. So first of all, we have the rise of landed families, merchant elites, trade networks, and local entrepreneurship. For people, we have the rise of new towns. We have money. Look at the father, this Abdel Razak El Daoud, and his different family sons, all wearing tarbushes, was like the top of modernity in the Ottoman period, and holding books. Their father was not really, was not illiterate, but his sons were. One of his sons later became one of the chief, let's say, rebel leaders during the great Arab uprising, colonial insurrection during the 1930s. On the other side, we have one of the same villages is, let's say, cousin-in-law, Abdul Rahman al-Hajj Ibrahim, who began his tenure as a son of an Ottoman tax farmer. He purchased, he went and learned Turkish and started working in the Tapo office, and ended up being one of the top 3 land entrepreneurs in the entire district. And then we can see how all of this plain that was heavily forested just a century before, or even half a century before, became covered with vast, let's say, bayarat or orchard citrus groves. And we can see 3 of them. This is the green ones are the Hajj Ibrahims, and the blue ones belong to a different family called Hanuns. And you can see how the villages, it was a time of growth, economic growth. And here are one of these estates. This is another example. Here we have the interactions between new structures, education, and traditional structures. For example, the division of responsibilities inside a patriarchal household. We have one of these rabbas, one of these forest estates by the name of Taiba el-Kibliya. This is the southern plot. Was owned by El Qasem family. It's another offshoot of the same, let's see, Effendis that I've showed here. And this divided their, their roles. One of them was the overseer of the homestead. This is the elder son. The youngest one was a merchant entrepreneur, and the middle one was a local strongman politician and very, let's say, very violent and innovative gangster. Okay, he grew 40 hectares of marijuana, and found a way to, when it was discovered, to clear it out by one night and then laugh at the British soldiers which he entertained. And when they come out in the morning, said there was nothing here, it was all dura, you ate it, this is your food that you ate yesterday. And again, look at how this is especially very complex, let's say, arrangement. Here we have the manor house, here we have wells. Each and every land has its name and use for field crops, for cultivation of citrus fruit, and housing, and there were also beneficence, public fountains, and such and such and such. What are the conclusions I would like to suggest to you, to consider? Yes? Okay. First of all, my presentation or my larger work has demonstrated the importance of considering systems of land use and tenure, and of utilizing local sources. I've shown that the modernization of the Sharon and also the Levant began long before the arrival of Napoleon to Acre, to the Levant, which was regarded as the, let's say, the beginning of the modern age in the Middle East. It's part of a long durée of existence of the interactions between people and landscapes, different types of settlements by different social groups coexisted same time and place, and it was a continuation. The migration to the Sharon during even the British Mandate period was a continuation of existing trends. And during the British Mandate period, the Arab settlement in the country continued to grow, aided by the material contribution of the increasing Jewish presence into the area. Jews purchased land, but the funds that became available, the capital that became available to Arab entrepreneurs, allowed them to build up new estates, to come up with new initiatives. And I would like to conclude by thanking you for listening.